FOXTROT.
Band, Genesis. Album, FOXTROT. Songs on the album. Side 1, Song First, Watcher of the Skies. Side 1, Song Second, Timetable. Side 1, Song Third, Get 'Em Out by Friday. Side 1, Song Fourth, Can Utility and the Coastliners. Side 2, Song First, Horizons. Side 2, Song Second, Supper's Ready. This composition consists of the following parts: A. Lover's Leap, B. The Guaranteed Eternal Sanctuary Man, C. Akhenaten and Itzikon and Their Band of Merry Men, D. How Dare I Be So Beautiful, E. Willow Farm, F. Apocalypse in 9/8, co-starring the delicious talents of Gabriel Ratchet, G. As Sure as Eggs, Aching Men's Feet. Release date, October 6, 1972. Recorded, London, Island Studios, from July to August 1972. Engineer, John Burns. Producers, David Hitchcock and Genesis. Artwork, Paul Whitehead. Musicians, Tony Banks, organ, mellotron, piano, electric piano, 12-string, voices. Steve Hackett, electric guitar, 12-string and 6-string solo. Phil Collins, drums, voices, assorted percussion. Peter Gabriel, lead voice, flute, bass drum, tambourine, oboe. Michael Rutherford, bass pedals, 12-string guitar, voices, cello. Richard McPhail, equipment and stage sound, sound friend.
The making of FOXTROT album. In March 1972, Genesis went into the recording studio with the specific intention of making a single. I seem to remember, says Hackett, that Richard Branson gave us a free day at the Manor studio. The chosen track was Happy the Man, an acoustic folk ballad written by Mike Rutherford, which had already been part of their live set for at least a year. The idea was to try out the market with something short, just 3 minutes long, and catchy. Banks. We always used to like the fact that, in the early days of the Beatles, their singles weren't on their albums. She Loves You wasn't on with the Beatles, or whatever. We always thought of Happy the Man as a single, so we were keen to do it in that format, hoping it would be a hit. In the same period, another song was also recorded, Wooden Mask, for the purpose of making a possible follow-up single. Alas, these tapes have been irretrievably lost. In the meantime, the new album was being written in fits and starts due to the fact that the band was nearly always touring. During the first Italian tour, the one in April 1972, a song introduced as Bye Bye Johnny featured at some of the gigs. Bye Bye Johnny would eventually evolve into Can Utility and the Coastliners, while another track set to become of great importance to the band, Watcher of the Skies, also started to take shape in terms of music and lyrics during this tour. Notwithstanding their hectic schedule, during quieter periods the group would try to find the necessary concentration to write new material, every now and again renting a rehearsal room. Collins. We never managed to rehearse for more than 1 week in the same place. I remember 1 week in Woolwich and another at Una Billings, a dance school in London. Some of the album was written in Chessington because a friend of a friend had a house there. Hackett. We rehearsed in different places. There was a place in Chessington and a rehearsal room in West Hampstead, near the station. I can't remember if it belonged to John Mayall or his son. Una Billings is where we wrote Supper's Ready. After their initial period of euphoria, the two new members, perhaps still not completely integrated into the band, went through a rather unsettled period. Hackett. Now and again, Phil and I would threaten to leave. Luckily, on the first day of recording FOXTROT, Mike and Tony told me they didn't want me to leave and that they really liked my guitar playing. It may seem strange, but I hadn't understood it at that point, mainly because within the band we didn't complement each other very much. I felt very insecure, and I thought maybe it was better to leave before I got sacked. When I realized they liked what I did and wanted me to stay, it was an epiphanal moment for me. I was allowed to play this solo piece, Horizons, which meant I had 1 minute and 30 seconds all to myself on the album. I know Phil considered leaving from time to time, but I don't know if he admits it these days. I think Lindisfarne wanted him to join at one point, and he was thinking about it. I think it's because we were so very, very tired. Fortunately, there was no lack of new material. In fact, not only was it flowing freely, but it was also exceptionally good. Hackett. As a band, we were trying to find our feet, hoping that the record company would renew the contract, and we were being given the thumbs up to develop very, very slowly. Thanks to Tony Stratton Smith, a wonderful man who signed acts he felt passionately about. He would give them, and us, many, many albums to make it. There was nothing meteoric about the rise of Genesis. It took a long time to make it happen, and you really needed to be putting bums on seats in those days. You played to people, and when you went back to the same town, you hoped there would be a bigger audience, and luckily for us, that's how it went. Most of the recording was done at the beginning of August at Island Records Studios in Basing Street, London, but just a few days in, the sessions had to be stopped so that they could accept a request to go back to Italy and tour for another week. The sessions turned out to be anything but plain sailing, mainly because the producer's seat remained empty following the split with John Anthony in May, in part possibly due to the lack of success achieved by the single Happy the Man, 7 Stones. Hackett, I don't know if it was because of that. I think Tony Stratton Smith felt that the power of the live band wasn't being captured on record, so felt that we needed a new producer and suggested Bob Potter. Potter was a young sound engineer who had worked with Bob Johnston, a producer with an impressive track record, Bob Dylan, Simon and Garfunkel, Leonard Cohen, and who had just produced Lindisfarne's highly successful album Fog on the Tyne. Stratton Smith evidently thought Johnston's assistant, Bob Potter, who in the meantime was learning the ropes on other English folk and rock albums, such as Pleased to See the King by Steele A. Span and Bell Plus Arc by Bell and Arc, would more than suffice for Genesis. Unfortunately, however, he soon started to clash with the band over their musical tastes and their attitude in the studio. Hackett. It used to take us a long time to set up and get the sound right. He thought we should be able to rock out a lot quicker than that, but we weren't that kind of band. At times, work was produced at an almost leisurely pace. I remember once, Mike was doing some 12-string stuff, and he didn't think the strings sounded bright enough, and he wanted to rest string, something which could take 2 hours. Bob Potter couldn't handle it. I think the only thing that worked, with Potter, was the night I recorded Horizons. It took 4 takes to get it right. I played it all the way through, so the version on the record has no edits. He said that was the only thing he enjoyed doing. I was aware that the chemistry wasn't working, and I wanted to try and make it work with him. Banks. Charisma were very keen for us to work with Bob Potter, who had worked with Lindisfarne, mainly because they wanted the lead vocals to sound louder and because they thought a real producer might be useful to us. So we went into the studio and started to record. But the minute I started playing the opening to Watcher of the Skies, Potter said he didn't like it and that he didn't think we should use it. After we tried a couple of other things, we realized that he might have been a good engineer, but he didn't actually like what we were doing. That meant we simply couldn't work with him, so we got rid of him. From this distance in time, it is not entirely clear whether Potter was fired or decided to leave of his own accord. Hackett. He was quite young and inexperienced, and he seemed to be on a collision course with the guys in the band. He ended up abandoning the project, and it was a very worrying time for us. It's very depressing when your producer quits. Personally, I don't think he should have got involved with Genesis, because I don't think he liked our music. He liked more obvious rock and roll. I think the subtleties of Genesis were lost on him, although he did like Horizons. I gather that was the only part he liked, probably because he wasn't dealing with the whole band, just one member of it. Potter's replacement as producer was David Hitchcock, who was again brought in by Stratton Smith. Hitchcock. Strat asked me if I was interested in producing Genesis. He knew I had just produced In the Land of Grey and Pink by Caravan, which contained the sweet 9 Feet Underground, which took up one side of the album, so I knew how to do that kind of recording. Genesis had written Supper's Ready, which was similar in length and structure, consisting of several pieces of music that were very different but were conceived as one suite. I was also starting to get a reputation for producing prog rock, having done successful albums by Caravan, East of Eden, and various other similar bands. So I met Genesis, and we went into the studio, which I knew, with an engineer I didn't know, Tony Platt, that I wasn't too happy with. So I changed to another engineer that I did know and who I knew I could work with called John Burns, who worked very well with the band and went on to produce the next 2 albums. Banks. When Potter left, we ended up working with just the engineer Platt, but we weren't too sure about him either, so we changed engineer halfway through the recording of Supper's Ready. We recorded the first half of the song with the first engineer, then we got this other guy, John Burns, and we finished off the song with him. Hackett, when John Burns heard the 12-string stuff we'd already recorded for Supper's Ready, he really liked it and said we should continue with it. And that was very important for the band. This new team was much more encouraging. I liked David Hitchcock very much as a person, but the dialogue was between John Burns and us because he was an engineer and consequently much more hands-on. Ironically, it was John Burns who was to stay the course in the long term because he was very enthusiastic and a great engineer who seemed to know how to deal with everybody. He had a nice way about him. He worked with us on FOXTROT, Selling England by the Pound, and The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway, and he was also a guitarist, so he was good at getting guitar sounds. During these studio sessions, Twilight Alehouse, which dates back to Anthony Phillips' days, was finally recorded, even if it never made it to the final track list. Banks. This song was already around when we did Trespass, but for some reason or other, we didn't record it. We kept back one or two songs from the time of Trespass that we could have done. There was another song called Let Us Now Make Love, one of Ant's songs, which we kept back as a possible single. We knew Twilight Alehouse was a good stage song, and we finally got around to recording it during the FOXTROT sessions, but we had other material by then, and it became an extra, so we decided to leave it off, and it eventually ended up as the B-side of I Know What I Like, released as a single the following year. Now I think it was actually really good, definitely better than half the ones that ended up on the record. Tastes change. We just had a different attitude at the time. The album. After that difficult third album, Nursery Crime. Difficult because of the changed band lineup and especially because of the loss of Anthony Phillips, who had been the leading songwriter. Genesis made a giant leap forward in their creative growth and musicianship with FOXTROT. FOXTROT is above all associated with Supper's Ready, the band's first and only recorded suite. Other suites were planned for the Duke and Abacab albums, but were abandoned during album recording sessions. Supper's Ready is 23 minutes long, takes up almost the whole of side 2 on the album, and represents a broader, more variegated and artistically relevant songwriting effort than comparable works by other artists of the same period. It is made up of 7 movements, beautifully fitted together, with an ending which restates themes from earlier parts of the song, with a profusion of styles and atmospheres in the middle, ranging from pastoral to symphonic, from grotesque to dramatic. Supper's Ready is considered by many to be the crowning glory of Genesis' entire career, an extraordinary epic which never becomes tiring nor repetitive throughout its long evolution. That said, anyone trying to heap all of their praise for the album on the suite alone would be misguided, as this record is the logical evolution of the previous one. Side 1, in fact, contains 3 songs which are milestones in the history of early Genesis. The monumental introduction of the syncopated Watcher of the Skies, the theatrical and composite Get 'Em Out by Friday, and its satirical lyrics laced with social comment, and the intricate top-level progressive rock displayed in Can Utility and the Coastliners. And while Timetable, in its absolute agreeableness, has to make do with a minor status, Horizons, a delicate sketch for 6-string acoustic guitar, which opened side 2 ahead of Supper's Ready, became a musical symbol for the band, especially for its author and performer, Steve Hackett. Hackett, now on his second album with Genesis, is the musician showing the most encouraging progress in his songwriting ability, composing not only Horizons, but also much of Can Utility and the Coastliners. He also managed to get his proverbial finger into different parts of the pie, that is, Supper's Ready, while continuing to develop his technique and creativity for the band. A guitarist with little inclination for pyrotechnics, Hackett knew exactly what was needed for the sound of Genesis and limited himself to providing just that. Very subtle solos, often highly original in their melodic structure, and background work on the electric guitar and on the 12-string at the beginning of Supper's Ready. Maybe a little inconspicuous, but absolutely delightful and ultimately essential for achieving the result. The other new element, Collins, still wasn't a fully fledged songwriter at this stage. However, with his amazing drumming technique and touch, he managed to bring extraordinary gear changes into certain sections of songs, Watcher of the Skies, Get 'Em Out by Friday, and some parts of Supper's Ready, which, without his prowess, would never have reached such formidable heights. Furthermore, his voice supports Gabriel's vocals in many places, becoming a sort of echo and counterbalance. Mike Rutherford, on the other hand, was continuing to grow as a bass player. His parts on Watcher of the Skies and Get Him Out by Friday are outstanding. And he also confirmed himself as the binding force for the whole band with his 12-string guitar and his supporting role in the more adventurous parts like in Apocalypse in 9/8. That said, his songwriting contribution still hadn't reached the maximum level, as Mike was more inclined to write brief sections as opposed to whole songs. On this album, Tony Banks' songwriting capabilities finally came to the fore. Timetable, the intro to Watcher of the Skies, the structure of Get Him Out by Friday, and almost half of the music which went into creating Supper's Ready, including much of the improvisation with Mike and Phil of the Apocalypse in September 8th section, were written by Banks. So, on their fourth album, the keyboard player won himself the role of Genesis' chief songwriter, despite being in a band full of writers, a position he would never relinquish. And Gabriel? His vocals had acquired even more shades, interpreting different characters within the same song and expertly exploiting the tricks of the trade in the recording studio. Although musically he limited himself to composing Willow Farm, Gabriel concentrated on writing complicated lyrics for Supper's Ready and proved to be a sophisticated fantasy storyteller full of irony on Get Him Out by Friday.
Gabriel, therefore, remained the main author of the lyrics, but the others also made their contribution. Steve wrote the words to Can Utility and the Coastliners, Tony the lyrics for Timetable and Watcher of the Skies, in the latter case with the help of Mike. 1972 was an extraordinary year for music. Starting on the other side of the Atlantic, Creedence Clearwater Revival released their seventh and last album, Mardi Gras. Neil Young and Lou Reed released two radically different masterpieces. The Pastoral Harvest for the Canadian and the Lush Transformer for the ex-Velvet Underground singer. Meanwhile, thanks to weather reports I Sing the Body Electric, jazz was becoming appetizing even to the rock lover's palate. The British rock scene was also vibrant with Pink Moon, Nick Drake's third and final album, Deep Purple's Machine Head, David Bowie's The Rise and Fall of Ziggy Stardust, and The Spiders from Mars, and not forgetting Exile on Main Street by the already legendary Rolling Stones. The progressive rock scenario was also stronger than ever. However, whilst Gentle Giant with Three Friends and Emerson, Lake and Palmer with Trilogy released strong records, Genesis boasted a creative supremacy which at this stage, and arguably for the last time, only Yes with Close to the Edge seemed able to counteract. Of particular note is that John Anderson's band, among other things, created a convincing suite for its album, which took up a whole side, while Jethro Tull took it one step further by writing a single song for the entire record, Thick as a Brick, divided into two parts of course. Foxtrot, however, took the top spot as Best Prog Album of the Year, an accolade gained in a highly creative musical context. The songs on the album Foxtrot. Side 1. Track first. Watcher of the Skies. Gabriel. It was a very important track for us. On the live side it was a key number. Although Tony was the lead writer of the song, in particular, the mellotron chords in the intro are his, I did some work on the verses and chorus. Producer David Hitchcock. We wanted to get a big sound from the mellotron. We were working in the studio too at Basing Street in London, which was a small Studio Island Studios now called SARM Studios, but also known as Basing Street Studios, established by Chris Blackwell and located in Notting Hill, London, and I think it was John Burns who suggested we use Studio One upstairs, the big studio, and put up some big speaker stacks and use distance mics and record all the room, as well as recording directly from the mellotron. That is how we got that sound, which some producers have asked me about afterwards. Rutherford. I remember hearing Tony playing those opening chords in one of those big palasports on an Italian tour. The echoes were booming round and it sounded fantastic. The band was gaining some darkness in terms of the music. I think it's got a fantastic intro and the rhythm's great. Looking back on it, however, I think it's a little too busy. Collins. Every Wednesday I used to go and see Yes at the Marquee. I wanted to bring a little bit of that musicianship into the band, the tricky arrangements they used to have. I used to say, it's a shame we can't do stuff like that. Certainly the intro is all Tony of course, but the next part came from my drumming. Hackett. It was actually a combo of everybody. The intro is Tony's, the rhythm is Phil's, while the crescendo and the dynamics of the 6/4 riff, being done very softly and then very loud, were my ideas. Tony was using the mellotron, a mixture of brass and strings, while the bass part on the intro is done with the mellotron piano accordion. He also used to like putting the mellotron through Leslie cabinets, which made it sound more like an organ. The recorded version is much faster than the live version used to be. I think it would be impossible to play it live at that speed. In the melodic part of the track, Hackett is doubling Mike's bass line. Hackett. The staccato rhythm idea was Phil's. He thought it should sound like Morse code. The rhythm changes towards the end of the song, going from 6/4 to 4/4. It's very difficult to do a melody line over a rhythm like that, so the melody line floats over the top. For some people, there might be too much punctuation and not enough statement, so arguably the best part of the song lies in the instrumental at the beginning and right at the end. I love the song very much. It was unlike anything anyone else was doing up to that point, half classical and half rock. A song that used to divide people. In America, they found it too classical, too removed from the roots of rock and roll. Banks. I don't think this song stands the test of time as well as some of the others. I find some of the vocal parts a bit embarrassing. The lyrics were written by Tony and Mike one afternoon, while the band was touring in Italy in April 1972. Inspiration was provided by the desolate landscape which they could see from the roof of the Hotel de Michiana in Naples, looking over Viale Kennedy, and the Mostra di Ultramare trade exhibition site. Rutherford. I remember writing the lyrics with Tony, sitting on a roof outside the bedroom window of a hotel in Italy. Looking around, you could see all these other tar roofs, and there was no one around, a sort of lunar landscape. This song is definitely a period piece. With the passing of the years, I've learned that you can't just use the words you want to say. They've got to sing well. Watcher of the skies, watcher of all, is a bit of a stiff lyric. The lyrics combine elements from literature and comic books. Banks. I had just read Childhood's End by Arthur C. Clarke, where the population moves on to the next level and disappears, which was fun, and we combined that with the Watcher, a Marvel Comics character who just observes and can't take any active part or anything. So we combined these ideas and wrote the lyrics inspired by this very hot day. And this Where's Everybody Gone? Sensation. Side 1. Track 2nd. Timetable. Banks. In the early days, I was perhaps more free. With this song, for example, I came in with a complete piece saying, right, this is this, and we did it. Tony is therefore the sole writer of this song. Conducted by a piano sound of times gone by, classical with a Renaissance touch. Hackett. It's quite simple for a Genesis song. A piano intro and I'm doubling part of the piano work while Mike plays bass and there's a single vocal. It was a lovely song in the rehearsal room, but the recorded version sounded a bit dry. The remix of this song is brighter, and you can hear the sound of the guitar which was put through a Leslie cabinet, which was a Beatles trick. Even in a simple song like this, there is always room for a touch of genius. Hackett. At 1 minute and 37 seconds we used tubular bells, while the solo melody which comes in at 1 minute 43 seconds was played with the piano but by picking the strings inside the lid with a plectrum so it doesn't sound like a guitar or piano. The sound that plays out from inside the body of the piano is beautiful. It reminded me of Henry Mancini when he played on Charade. He wrote Moon River and other hits, and there's an element of that, so this track is a very accessible aspect of Genesis. This is not the sort of thing you hear from most rock bands as it modulates from key to key. Tony also wrote the lyrics, something which seems to cause him some slight embarrassment. It was pretty early days when I wrote it. We used to distribute the lyrics between us, but then as time went by, Peter wanted to write more and more, which was fine by me. After all, he was the singer and I didn't really care. I'm not in the business to write lyrics, I'm in it to write music. The same thing happened with Phil, really. By the end, he was writing more of the lyrics than anybody else. I think he's a very good lyric writer, so that was okay. Side 1. Track 3rd. Getting 'Em Out by Friday. Starting with some fragments of the 1969 track The Movement, this song took shape thanks to a collective effort. Banks. I had this riff which we developed as a group. Both ways of writing worked, but I think when the group all felt involved in the composition, it tended to produce a better result. Get 'Em Out by Friday is definitely the second best song on the album, after Supper's Ready. I think it's much better than Watcher of the Skies. Hackett. It's a kind of 6/8 rhythm, and at the beginning you can hear Pete, who was learning to play the oboe. So we had guitar and oboe playing together, which again is not a regular rock combination, and the divisions at 26 seconds are typical of Phil. Then, at 1 minute and 58 seconds, there is a guitar bit which I suggested to them. Rutherford's bass in this track is particularly effective. Hackett. Mike played bass, but he had the sensibility of a guitarist, so he played melodic lines. I think the best bass players think of it as counterpoint. They are coming up with another melody entirely to the vocal one. Mike was very good at that, and he was also very good at using bass pedals, so he was free to play the 12-string. Steve's guitar solo is truly original. Hackett. I used a fuzz box and a small Fender Champ amp. I was playing double notes and everyone says I had a great sustain, but I wanted the guitar to have better sustain than that. I was using jazz tone in those days, which made little impression on the overall sound. The song is characterized by different sections with strong rhythm parts and parts that are unusually soft. Rutherford. This is an example of where we had too much stuff on a song. I mean, the track was great without any vocals, it sounded good, but when the vocals came on, despite the very clever lyrics and great performance from Peter, there was almost too much in there. Later on, we started to realize that there's a danger in not getting the voice laid down early on when you're actually playing tracks. In those days, we'd often do the track instrumentally, then someone would go away and come back with a lyric and vocal ideas which hadn't been sung much beforehand. In later songs, we realized that you can just play the chord of A for 8 bars, which instrumentally sounds a bit boring, but when there's a great vocal on top, it really works because it gives you more space. This song suffered a bit from having just too many good ideas in it. Collins. Because there was nothing to sing to start with, Peter would be playing his bass drum, his tambourine or the flute and shouting some things. We couldn't really hear him because it was a rehearsal room and the PA wasn't very good, so we'd write these great things that actually sounded like instrumental tracks. Then Pete would go away and come back with a lyric, but then the song would become too crowded. Adding a voice at that stage meant things would come back a little dense. But by that time it was too late because we'd already recorded the backing tracks. Banks. There's a clever idea in the middle of the song where Peter plays real flute, and I'm playing mellotron flutes at 4 minutes and 56 seconds in harmony. It's a lovely sad piece. Hackett. In the middle of this rocking tune, we decided to strip it right back to the silence and minimalism of real flute and mellotron flute together. Phil's drums with a fast tom break at 5 minutes and 27 seconds is a funny characteristic of Genesis, combining energy and restraint. This song has a level of stasis in it that most rock bands wouldn't have touched. There's no feeling of the need to entertain here, and I always thought this was a very nice part. There's a sense of Old English music in it. At 6 minutes and 5 seconds, Gabriel starts singing again with a range of bizarre vocal effects. Hackett. Pete used to like doing this thing. If you put headphones on, you can hear a repeat echo of the voice, but not the original singer. In the middle of this song, he acted out different parts. It's almost Gilbert and Sullivan with a Dickensian character. Gabriel. I tried to put some sort of Dickensian feel into this song. In a way, musically, that was something I don't think we managed to deliver. On the recording side, some of the things were too stretched, and on other things we were still trying to find our way with sound and arrangement. The lead singer doesn't deny there were problems with the metric. Gabriel. I think it did end up too wordy. The song was essentially about people being kicked out of rented accommodation. It was based on some of the Rackman stories about bad landlords. Perek Rackman was a landlord who operated in Notting Hill and became notorious for his exploitation of tenants, and I put in a little extra thought about evolving the species. The idea of making people shorter so that you can get more apartments in the same building was meant to be a comment on the attitudes of landlords towards tenants, along with the idea that genetic engineering may, at some point in the future, be used to control our evolution, maybe not in my lifetime but in my children's lifetime. There may be a decision to go smaller as a way of using fewer of nature's resources. So in part social comment and in part prophetic. Hackett. It's about people, the corruption of government. It's an interesting track. It's multifaceted, but mainly it has a claustrophobic feel about it. Funnily enough, when we were working on it, Donovan walked into the studio. I went out to speak to him, and he said that the part where the flute and mellotron flutes play together sounded like rows and rows of houses. Banks. I think it's one of Pete's best lyrics. Side 1. Track 4th. Can Utility and the Coastliners. Banks. Every piece on this worked pretty well, and the end section is really good. I know a lot of people consider it one of their favorite tracks, and it is a really good song, but it does suffer from being a bit fragmented. Divided into 3 main sections, the first is acoustic, The second is characterized by a long, flowing mellotron part, while the third is more rhythmic. This song sprang mainly from an idea provided by Steve Hackett. I wrote everything up to 1 minute and 50 seconds, but the guitar break is Mike's, played with two 12 strings in harmony. I think the part from 2 minutes and 11 seconds is one of the best bits of Genesis music, as you've got the bass pedal very simple, but Tony is doing this whole impression of a string orchestra with the mellotron strings, and he's being quite free with the use of chords. He's basically ignoring the chords and doing what he wants. It really shouldn't work because the chords are being drowned out by the weight of the strings, but it works in a way that music shouldn't, while the 12 strings are not moving at all, just repeating the same thing. Very clever. This idea of the organ and mellotron from 3 minutes and 23 seconds playing together was influenced by Procol Harum's Wreck of the Hesperus. I remember Phil wanted Mike to play bass at 3 minutes and 44 seconds, but he refused. So the bass kicks in later, and you influence Chris Squire, the fast bass playing. Again, in this case, the guitar solo is extremely original. Hackett. Yeah, strange, isn't it? All faded in. Hearing this now, I think it is a solo I would have played again. It was difficult to play anything over that chord sequence. The guitar sounds like a synthesizer on this. As it fades in, it goes to distortion. At 5 minutes and 17 seconds, you can hear Phil's influence. And I wrote the vocal melody at the end of this section. Steve was also the author of the lyrics. Hackett. The lyrics tell the story of an English king called Nut. He was concerned about his people flattering him and telling him he could do anything, so he had his throne put on the seashore, and he commanded the waves to go out, but they didn't. He was just trying to prove the point that he was only human and not immortal. He was trying to demythologize royalty. He's an interesting character to me, as most leaders are self-aggrandizing, and he seemed to be the opposite. So he had a certain amount of modesty. Side 2. Track first. Horizons. Irritated by the exasperatingly long time it was taking Rutherford to change his guitar strings, the soon-to-be-replaced producer, Bob Potter, asked Steve if he had anything ready. When Hackett played him his short acoustic piece, Potter was so pleased with it that in the end, Horizons ended up being the only track he produced in full. Hackett. I had been trying to get an acoustic guitar sound like that for ages.
At that time, I was hearing people playing 6-string acoustic guitars and thinking about the beautiful sounds they were getting. It is beautiful. If you've got the right melody, it can sound wonderful. I used an acoustic guitar, a Japanese Yairi, fed through 2 Leslie cabinets to give it that phasey sound which was typical of Genesis. A lot of the arpeggiated guitar work was put through them. It was a favorite of ours before the days of using chorus or pitch shift. Gabriel. It's a lovely piece, almost like a classical guitar piece. But being played before supper's ready meant it became absorbed by this bigger entity. Even though, at the end of the day, its inclusion in Foxtrot was down to chance, the track had, in any case, been proposed to the band by Steve Hackett. I played it to the rest of the band on electric guitar because it was easier in the rehearsal room, saying, I don't know if this is right for the band as it is just a solo piece, about 1.5 minutes long. Phil said it sounded like there ought to be applause at the end of it. I'd been influenced by the length of a piece called The Earl of Salisbury by William Byrd, and what I liked about it was the brevity of it. It took me a whole year to write this short piece of music, which is based on a Bach piece for cello. When it was done, I was very proud of it and thrilled that the band thought it was good enough to use. In the early days, I really had an inferiority complex, and before we were due to start recording Foxtrot, I offered to leave the band because I didn't feel I'd contributed enough. I was frustrated that I had all these ideas, but I couldn't really get them out. But they said, no, we really like your guitar playing and want you to stay. And that made a real difference to me. I remember Ringo Starr telling a similar story about the Beatles. He offered to leave, but they said no, they liked what he was playing. I think I underestimated my effect on the band. I was a bit too modest, and what I hadn't realized was that the band was quite competitive, and so just because you didn't get an idea through it didn't mean it wasn't up to scratch. That was the case when Mike wrote The End of Shadow of the Hierophant, a track which Hackett later elaborated and used on his first solo album Voyage of the Acolyte. It was an amazing sound. It was like a whole world within itself. It had this circular effect of energy. The band sounded like an orchestra, and yet it had the power of rock as well. It was rehearsed with the band, and it could have, and I think should have, been on Foxtrot. I couldn't believe we could pass it by. Side 2. Track second. Supper's ready. Gabriel. We were gaining confidence. Live, we were going very well at that point, even though, financially things weren't good. There was a great rapport with the audience building, and it was beginning to move around other countries. That gave us the mental platform on which to build something like Supper's Ready, which is still one of the things I like best. Supper's Ready is a suite divided into 7 movements lasting just over 23 minutes. A web of melodies, great progressive rock, typically English pantomime, and an alternating of soft and loud sections, which is pure genius. Collins. We didn't know what it was going to sound like till we spliced the tape together. The Guaranteed Eternal Sanctuary Man, I think, was Peter's, and Willow Farm was another one of his Harold the Barrel type things. The big instrumental parts took shape when we were rehearsing at Una Billings School of Dance in Shepherd's Bush. Banks. I think we were writing better together as a group, although a lot of the individual stuff was still there. On this album, we'd come in with ideas, a riff or something. The beginning of Supper's Ready, and what became the end section, was something I'd written on guitar at university. But the strongest stuff was written as a group, like Apocalypse and 9/8, which was something that Mike, Phil, and I just wrote, improvising, working out a big keyboard solo together and a way of playing it. Rutherford. Supper's Ready is the track that really made the album very special. And to think we never knew what we were doing. We had a whole lot of bits, and then we started to string them together. The second half showed a bit more freedom. It was really just me, Phil, Tony, and Steve sort of jamming. We were just playing down at the bottom all the time, but with no movement, so Tony could move around the chords a lot, building up to that 666-bit, which was one of those few moments in our career where we actually got a great sounding thing, and then Pete came in with a vocal line we hadn't sung together. He just laid it on top. We hadn't been rehearsing it like that. He just came in, and it sounded fantastic. I would liken it to Mama, where the middle section came about similarly. We just went in, and then Phil laid this vocal down, which was just fantastic, so strong. It shows a bit more freedom because we, now, tend to write songs which are much more compact. Here we would stay on a section for a bit longer and let things happen. What I've always loved about this business as a writer is that you learn it as you go along, and there's luck. Things that seem quite effortless, as this was, are always good. The end section is very powerful, but one of my favorite pieces is Willow Farm, which I think is like Harold the Barrel because it has a bit of that humor in it, which was always important for us. Had it been just a long song without this piece, Supper's Ready would have been a little straight. Hack it. Supper's Ready works because it's so unusual. There are lots of bits in it. If you don't like one bit, that's over fairly quickly, and you're on to another bit. If you didn't like the little acoustic folky bit, then you've got another bit full of time signatures, and you've got a bit of 9/8. Then eventually it all meets up because all roads lead to Rome in the end, and you've got Pete's apocalyptic take on it, lyrically speaking. Thanks. We decided we were really going to go for the long one this time. We'd done the musical box and Stagnation, and we thought, well, let's just go for one whole side of an album, 23 minutes of music and see what we can do. The song started off just like Stagnation. The first 2 or 3 minutes were based on this guitar piece I'd written, which I thought was a really strong opening part with a lovely melody, which we carried on developing. We added little tinkly bits and a few vocal bits, and I suddenly thought if we weren't careful, it could end up sounding exactly like the musical box. So I said we should just stop the song after a really romantic bit and go straight into this other piece we had, which was Willow Farm. We thought having this really pretty bit with this really ugly, cool sequence suddenly coming in after that would sound great. And so that's what we did. That suddenly took the whole song to another dimension, with the drums coming in and everything else. The second half of Supper's Ready becomes very electric, and I think that produced our best piece of composition during the period with Peter, particularly from Apocalypse in September 8th onwards. It was just a coincidence to some extent what happened there. It was another of those places where I had this keyboard solo that ended on these big chords, and I had this idea of there just being some sort of vocal harmonies going on. Then Peter started singing on top of it, and I thought, oh shit, here he goes again. But when I heard it back, I thought it sounded fantastic, and it was the real peak of the song. You have the long build-up of this keyboard solo, which starts very sweet and then gets slightly more sinister, and then suddenly it's this big chord, and then 666 comes in. It's an incredibly strong moment, and I think for the early fans, it was the big moment on stage. It was tremendous, but I think Supper's Ready needed all the extra stuff at the beginning. It's like foreplay, you had to have all that to get to that one big moment. When we first heard it played back, I was very proud of it. David Hitchcock. The end of Supper's Ready with the Apocalypse in 9/8 section with the 666 is no longer a lone part. It is just so powerful. That part was spine-tingling. Hack it. This was a time when rock music was getting more articulate, the chords were getting more complex. It was still very English-sounding. But there was a lot of humorous stuff as well, like the wonderful moment called Willow Farm, a very funny and very witty piece. I remember Pete and I telling the others that we couldn't present this great long piece of music live if we didn't have everything going for it, and so it had to have the lights, it had to have the sound effects. There was a certain resistance within the band that maybe it wasn't musical, maybe it was a bit gauche. I realized that they were going to crucify us if we didn't sling everything at it, and so we did, and we got away with it. When you read interviews at the time, everyone felt very exposed. They felt they'd gone out on a limb. I think with Supper's Ready, this great long piece of meandering music going all over the place, we wondered if it wasn't indulgent and stretching the attention span of a fickle audience. Luckily, people came out in favor of it, saying it was really wonderful. We weren't preaching to the converted at that stage. We were in search of an audience. So it was the antithesis of what was to follow: short songs, snappy video sans rhythm. In those days, the audience was your judge and jury. There was no media backup at that time, no radio support. If you did long songs, you weren't on the radio. That was that. Even if you did a short one, you had to queue up with all the rest. If the BBC didn't like you, you could wait in the wings forever. Luckily, we played to lots of great audiences, and I think the theatrics helped tremendously. Everything got better, it got more professional. Banks. Back in the 1970s, they used to have these sorts of polls, and I remember on Nicky Horn's show on Capital Radio, the #1 rock track of all time was Stairway to Heaven, inevitably, but #2 was Supper's Ready. That wouldn't happen now. One of the reasons for that is that it subsequently never gets played because it's too long. No radio station is going to play a song that's 23 minutes long. Is it? That applies even in England, so it's not really known apart from by people who know and like the group and bought the album or saw the live shows. We were always tempted to try and do it on stage, but it is 23 minutes of a show, and that's an awful lot of time to give over to one piece from that period. If we had done it on the tour in 2007, we wouldn't have been able to do the In the Cage medley, which has the advantage of being able to go into lots of different areas. Nor could we condense Supper's Ready into a 15-minute version because the fans would want to hear the whole thing. Due to the length of the track, it was recorded at different times and even in different studios. Banks. Mike and I went into another studio to actually stick the two parts together because we'd run out of studio time. Incidentally, they were actually slightly out of tune, so we had to slow down the track to make it work. Something we were able to rectify in the remixes. Hack it. The new mixes have fixed certain things. For example, there was a moment of confusion when we had machines running at different tape speeds. I expect there are all these bands out there trying to copy that, wondering how we managed to get that quarter tone moment. It's lovely to hear our music sounding really good, but at the same time, there's always this problem, when you do remixes, with the purists thinking that you're messing with their childhoods. How dare you remix that? But you've just got to accept that these are different mixes. If you liked it the old way, the older grainier stuff, that's still there, you can compare it. The first section of the song, Lover's Leap, is a delightful acoustic sketch based, albeit not exclusively, on a piece of music written by Tony. Hack it. The opening sequence is Tony Banks. It's the same chord sequence Procol Harum used on A Salty Dog. There are 3 12-string guitars at the beginning playing the same part. Me, Mike, and Tony, with Tony's guitar going through 2 Leslie cabinets. Mike also played cello and I think bass pedals as well. He used Vox bass pedals in those days. Now, Pete, when he sang this originally, he sang up an octave. You can hear the strained voice at the top. It didn't sound right to my mind, so I suggested he sing an octave down and we had the 2 at the same time. Before the second subsection of the song, there is a long acoustic interlude from 1 minute and 58 minutes, upon which Peter and Phil's vocal harmonies and subsequently the electric piano are layered. Hack it. This was my bit, with 2 12-string guitars playing in harmony. The idea of the vocals fading in and out at 2 minutes and 11 seconds was mine as well, and then Tony plays the melody on the Hohner pianette. All of this part with the acoustic guitars was recorded with Bob Potter, but I think that's as far as we got with him. This was a substantial way into the song, and we were worried that it didn't sound right because the producer didn't like it. Turns out there was nothing wrong with it, just the wrong combination of characters. There's this thing about the Genesis 12 string. It sounds like a harpsichord, like a keyboard. So even when we used guitars, they sounded like keyboards, and sometimes the keyboards sounded like guitars. The Guaranteed Eternal Sanctuary Man is again mainly Tony's work and dates back to a much earlier period. Hack It. This was from another song that we already had, a very 60s early chord sequence, very deliberately naive. I did this very economical guitar work. It is a section in which the song builds up rhythmically with the drums coming in and the heart-wrenching riffs of the solo guitar, while Gabriel strains his voice almost to breaking point. Hack It. I think it was a difficult area for Pete. It's very high for him, as you can hear. This takes us to the part where children's voices sing a slightly menacing chant. At 5 minutes and 30 seconds. Hack It. I don't think I was in the studio when that was recorded. It's a parody of the Rockin' Carol, actually. Peter just went out in the street and got a whole bunch of kids in and said, "Do you want to come and record something?" And so they did. Akhenaten and Itzikon and their band of merry men is a much more dynamic and lively section. Hack It. This is really based on Mike strumming on the 12th string, but my guitar is very loud in the mix, so you can hear I'm playing a note, but I'm also flicking the toggle switch to give it different tones. The idea behind the line, "and they're giving me a wonderful potion cost, I cannot contain my emotion." I may be wrong, but I think we were talking about Vietnam, about guys who were out of their brains in battle. Of course, it's not a new idea, is it? People often went into battle drunk, the English Navy with their tots of rum. At 7 minutes and 39 seconds, I play harmonics, but unfortunately, my guitar playing is very out of time. I should have relaxed more. Then, at 8 minutes and 3 seconds, there's some tapping, with Tony doing it in harmony as well on the Hohner pianette, through a fuzz box and echoing my phrase on the organ.
This section was a kind of collaboration of everyone, really. The sustained guitar note, at 9 minutes, sounds almost like a flute. I also used a small amp, a Fender Champ Jazz Tone. The scene slows down into the gentle "How Dare I Be So Beautiful," where Peter's singing lies on top of a bizarre keyboard crescendo and diminuendo. Hack It. From here, the album gets very interesting sonically. It's piano, 9 minutes and 39 seconds, but each time a chord is played, a fader on the desk comes in after the note has been struck. It's the sort of thing that guitarists do, play a note and fade in the volume pedal later. I think this depicts the disorientation of battle very well, referring to the lyrics, and I think the sharp contrast between this section and the incoming section is very good. This part is more Genesis-like and the next one more Beatles-K, a burlesque pantomime, but very good with the whole band playing as one. The guitarist here is, of course, referring to Willow Farm, fomented by a sudden change in pace, which evolves into a section divided into 2 parts. This very English and bizarre part of the song was written entirely by Gabriel, who sings it with different voices. Hack It. The voice was modified with pitch shift over a bass of mellotron brass, organ, and distorted guitar. Peter wanted to separate the 2 parts with all change. So I said, why not make it like a train station? Why not have the sound of slamming doors and trains? So Peter found a tape, and we used that on the recording, and when we did it live as well. King Crimson had done El Lizard around this time, which has a similar sound sonically, mellotron brass, organ, and distorted guitar or distorted bass. Strange and difficult to recognize voices sing The Soil, 13 minutes and 20 seconds. Hack It. I think it's Pete and Phil. Pete always wanted to be on his own when he recorded vocals, he didn't want anyone else around, so maybe just him and Phil. He wanted to be left alone. He didn't want the comments of everybody else, which I understand totally. In the end, his voice is very subconscious sounding, almost like Coronation Street, a well-known British television series. After the final riff of Willow Farm, there is an almost sinister interlude. Hack It. 14 minutes and 14 seconds, here I'm playing very high notes on the Les Paul, which sounds more like a Celesta. The guitar and the flute playing together owe something to the Dance of the Sugar Plum Fairy, by Tchaikovsky, because it has a sort of calm after the storm effect. But just when you think it's going to wind down and go out, the song really starts to brew up with the next section in 9/8, an unlikely 9/8 repeated riff with a keyboard solo over the top of it. Apocalypse in 9/8 is without doubt the real gem in the whole of Supper's Ready, a long section with an irregular rhythm which starts and finishes with Gabriel singing, but which in the middle exploits a long instrumental improvisation with Mike and Steve on rhythm guitars, Phil's momentous drumming, and a splendid organ solo from Banks. Collins, I remember I had something to do in the afternoon. When I came back, Mike and Tony had basically written Apocalypse in 9/8. Tony had written this riff without thinking about the time signature. I may have played it once or twice, but never really thought about it too much, and we went in to record it, still not really knowing what it was. It was one of those moments where the tape was playing and recording, and it just captured what was probably one of our best spontaneous moments. That's probably my favorite song on the album. I still listen to it and can't quite work out how it just all happened at the right time. Hackett, I was trying to make the sound of a muted trumpet, and I used to have to try and think metronomically about this riff and not allow myself to get distracted by anything that was going on around me. I'm playing in octaves, and Mike's playing bass pedals. Live, we would sometimes switch roles, and I'd be playing the bass pedals, a very difficult thing to do while sitting down. You get repetitive strain injury playing bass pedals that way. Phil is really the only one who was improvising here, his part is spontaneous, with no overdubs. Something may have been overdubbed, but not the drums. We didn't overdub drums in those days, more's the pity for Phil, he was stuck with whatever he did first of all. At the end of this section, you have mellotron and organ again with Mike and me playing the riff and Pete doubling it on oboe as well, 18 minutes and 56 seconds. The music slows down after Peter's voice comes back in and the suite turns around on itself. As Sure as Eggs picks up the initial melody of Lover's Leap, 20 minutes and 10 seconds. Hackett, I suggested that the return of the vocal melody should be done, like a sort of salute, so I suggested the bells and the snare drum roll so it would be almost anthemic and sound almost patriotic. And then you have the same melody as I Know a Fireman, 20 minutes and 49 seconds, from earlier. This was always an interesting sound, a combo of guitar and Tony's keyboards, there's something about that combination. After a last phase sung by Gabriel, the guitarist launches himself into some solo parts. Hackett, we were trying to finish the LP while we were touring in Italy. As soon as the second tour finished, August 1972, I flew back as I still had to do my guitar work on the end of Supper's Ready. I was the only one lucky enough to have a plane ticket, the rest were driving back overnight in a van that was moving very slowly. I wasn't trying to be a star about it, it's just that my parts needed to be done to complete the album. So I did these phrases at the end, and luckily Phil liked them very much, they were his favorite. In the 2008 remastered edition, a few extra seconds have been left in where you can hear additional, previously unknown, guitar parts. Hackett, I recorded a lot. There's tapping on some of the last phrases, a lot of reverb and repeat echo on the guitar, which comes through it almost like a fanfare. The composite and multifaceted music is accompanied by transcendental lyrics, written entirely by Gabriel, full of references that cannot possibly be summarized in just a few sentences. In extreme synthesis, it can be said that it celebrates good triumphing over evil. Hackett, I know Pete felt particularly close to this piece, he really meant it. I gather that some of it relates to a personal experience that he had. It's very personal to Pete. I can tell you to what it alludes. There is a Turner painting called The Angel Standing in the Sun, I think it relates to that, but there is also some stuff from the Book of Revelation, like 666, the number of the beast in the New Testament. Pete was also into this idea that Pythagoras used to write backwards in a mirror, codes and stuff for secrecy. Gabriel, Supper's Ready was again one of those journey songs, where we really tried to take people along this dream journey. When it worked, and we got to the New Jerusalem part at the end, you could really feel you were touching people. There was a guy who'd been Edith Piaf's promoter in Paris. I remember when he heard it for the first time, he invited us to perform it in his church in Normandy, and this was a guy who didn't normally relate to rock music. There were different ways you could capture people's imagination. We were beginning to know who we were as writers and also knew how to deliver it as performers. It's a coming-of-age piece, I think, in lots of ways.
The album artwork. Arguably one of the most loved by Genesis fans, this album cover is, oddly enough, the one least liked by the band members. Rutherford, I think the album cover was a little weak. I was never convinced about this one, and this was the last time we used Paul Whitehead. I think the lovely atmosphere on Trespass and Nursery Crime lies in the fact that they felt like paintings, and they had a nice texture. This felt a little bit, it was okay, but he just put together a bunch of images that were in the lyrics. Gabriel, I was less happy with this sleeve than I was with the first two. We'd already worked with Paul and got identified with him, but I think the style was losing some of its appeal to me, even though I think the Fox character, related to hunting and the hunted, worked. I was looking at all sorts of esoteric stuff and numerology at that time. In numerology, each letter carries a certain value, and so I wrote out A B C D F. The next time you come round, you get to O, and then you get to X, all of which are under the number 6, see diagram above, so there was this Revelation reference, 666, and all that crap, you know, a sort of hidden element to it which we were just playing around with. It wasn't the backwards playing devil-worshipping version but this mixture of Christian and pagan symbolism. Collins, for me, the artwork was getting a little bit busy, and I guess that was one of the reasons this was the last one Paul Whitehead did for us. I mean, Trespass did have, you know, an elegance about it, Nursery Crime was more butch, but this was just a bit busy, the lady figure with the fox's head, the bit of ice, the water. It didn't look professional for some reason. It's all a bit dated now. It does sum up the album, the period, and I thought it was okay but not particularly special. Hackett, when I first saw it, I wasn't sure about it, to be honest. It looked rather like a collage of unlikely things, several cutouts. Since then, I've come to understand the concept of collage a little more, and I think it works. It had this sort of flat, one-dimensional look because it was a collage, but I don't know what was painted and what was pasted on. Banks, I thought this was the weakest of the album covers Paul Whitehead did for us, certainly at that time, and it's rather difficult to view it objectively now. The mockery of the hunt was his idea, and it doesn't really relate to anything on the album. We sort of managed to give it a sense with the album title, Foxtrot, you know, to help rationalize it a little bit. Anyway, the album cover depicted Peter's costume after he started wearing it on stage and not the other way round. Banks is actually mistaken. Gabriel started wearing the red dress with the fox's head only at the end of September 1972, when the album was already finished and pressed, ready for release the next month.
Epilogue. Released throughout the world on October 6, 1972, Foxtrot represents Genesis' first real commercial success. For the first time, they made it into the UK charts, number 12, while in Italy, according to some music magazines from the time, it may even have reached the top of the charts. Rutherford, Foxtrot always appears to me as an album where things took us by surprise, particularly the end section of Supper's Ready. Later on in our career, that happened a lot more often, but in those days there were 5 of us, full of ideas, almost too many ideas going around, so bits like this, where things could just happen a bit more freely, were great. Collins, I have very fond memories of recording this album. We did most of it at Island Studios in Basing Street, and John Burns was the engineer who helped us. Hearing those things and Supper's Ready put together, it was very strong. We felt we were actually getting somewhere. We had a great album, and it came out and did better than the one before. There are a couple of songs that I don't remember at all. For example, Timetable. I have no idea what that song sounds like or anything. Of course, Horizons was the guitar thing that started Supper's Ready, but the ones that stand out are undoubtedly Supper's Ready and Watcher of the Skies. There are some things in Can Utility and the Coastliners that I liked, and I think I wrote a little bit of that, but I can't remember what it was now. Banks, on the whole, this is probably my favorite of the band's early albums. It felt like we really came of age with Foxtrot. It got to number 12 in the charts, which was a staggering thing for us. It was the first album where we sounded convincing to the outside world. We only convinced ourselves and maybe our fans with the first 2 albums, but with Foxtrot, people who had never heard of Genesis before became interested in it. It wasn't a big hit, but it certainly sold a lot more copies than its predecessors. Hackett. It's a multifaceted album. It's heavily influenced by classical music, but there is English humor in there as well, and I think having that parody, that send-up, was a very British trait. I remember Tony Stratton-Smith saying that he thought Foxtrot showed the breadth of the band's writing. I think we were a lot less certain when we played Supper's Ready to him. We thought he was going to say, "Sorry, boys, we're going to have to tear up your contract," because it was so extreme and long and convoluted. It touched on so many areas. I must say I was surprised when he received it so enthusiastically. He was more enthusiastic about that than he was about selling England. Going back to the time when it was conceived, we had our critics and supporters, and we didn't know who was going to win. It parallels on a much smaller scale what the Beatles had with Sgt. Pepper's. They never knew if people would like it or not. It was so drastically different. It's as far removed from pop as a band can go without moving into free jazz. I'm sure I have a different take on it all now than I did at the time. When I hear Sgt. Pepper's, I don't mind if it's not in time or in tune, because lots of it isn't, but when I hear Genesis, I want to hear it played perfectly. But it wasn't to be, it was recorded quickly and between tours. Gabriel. I never really listen to the old albums, unless I'm, in an interview situation. But when I do, it's amazing how quickly you fall back into those old roles and still want different things done in different tracks. I think you would probably get 5 different versions of all the songs if you allowed the different members of the band to do their own mix. And it's not just a question of the more me syndrome, it's just that sometimes there are different approaches and tastes. I didn't really get involved that much with the remixing. I made some comments on some of the stuff I was involved in, and I encouraged adopting a certain approach with the 5.1, where you have 3 speakers at the front and the 2 at the back, because a lot of people have 2 back speakers, which are throwaway, which cost half as much as the ones at the front. So you're either afraid of that, and therefore mix very conservatively, like enhanced stereo, or you say, fuck it. Let's just do it for people who have got the good systems and really make use and take advantage of being in this sort of 3-dimensional environment. That's the way I prefer. Foxtrot proves just how much Genesis were a band open to external stimuli. Hackett. I think a lot of Genesis tracks are only nominally rock pieces. We were influenced by Joni Mitchell and Judy Collins and Buffy Sainte-Marie, in my case, as much as we listened to Led Zeppelin. I loved Bach and blues. Mike liked folk as well as heavy stuff, and Tony loved classical music, but he also liked a lot of pop. He was a big fan of the Beatles. I remember us being interviewed by Melody Maker. We were all asked the same question, which we answered separately, no conferring, what our favorite single was. And 4 out of 5 of us said MacArthur Park, written by Jimmy Webb and sung by Richard Harris. When you listen to it, you realize you've got this parallel with a lot of Genesis tracks where you've got this verse and chorus thing followed by a weird middle bit, and then a long instrumental before you recapitulate towards the end. It's a little bit more like a sort of concerto form. We'd all listened to Jimmy Webb and thought he was brilliant, and still do. How many bands would combine a love of big band stuff with Buddy Rich, Shostakovich, Prokofiev, Bach and, in my case, Howlin' Wolf and Paul Butterfield and masses of blues players? But Foxtrot is also an album where the qualities of all the band members forcefully emerge in a formidable collective, which is the union of 5 great individuals. Hackett, the strange thing when you're in a band is that you don't really realize how great everyone is. You just see the others as the guys who play their own respective instruments. You haven't got time when you're a cog in the wheel of this thing that has to keep motoring. It's only when you've had years to reflect and listen to everyone's work both collectively and individually that you realize just how great everyone was individually and how they've all become gurus in their own right. A bit like Monty Python, who we shared the label. Monty Python was also signed to Charisma. Everybody's work stood out, and you realize it was more than the sum of the parts. It's funny because I think each of the guys has written a song at some point that could move me to tears, and you can't say that about most bands. Bands don't come like that. There's usually one guy who's the linchpin, and everyone sort of follows the indications of the one who is the musical director. Genesis wasn't like that. We were like a sort of musical co-op that had its strengths and weaknesses. Sometimes, very good ideas could get shafted at the committee stage. Sometimes the best ideas just had to be fought through like a cavalry charge, and that can be very difficult to do in a band that is a democracy. So, luckily, we gave each other enough leeway to make a lot of great things happen. I think it's true that the founding members did tend to hold sway, but we were all listened to, and that's important. I quickly realized that the best way of working was to bring out the best in all the others, so if anyone did anything that I thought was remotely good, I would always say it sounded really good and we should use it in something. I felt I was being the glue, but maybe everyone else will have a different take on it and say I was always arguing against them, that I was always competing. Even these days, whenever I work with people, it's always the same thing. If someone does something absolutely fantastic, I tell him he can do it again. You've always got to have the tapes rolling from the word go.
The concerts. With the Italian tour over and the recording of FOXTROT completed, it looked like Genesis were back to the same old routine. In September, they began touring the usual clubs in the UK, including Friars in Aylesbury, where they had built up quite a fan base, and the Marquee in London. They also managed to squeeze in an appearance at the French Cant Pop Festival in Montbéliard, France, on the 9th, alongside Van der Graaf Generator, Caravan, and Matching Mole, to name but a few. The setlist during this phase was pretty well defined and generally included Watcher of the Skies, Can Utility and the Coastliners, Get 'Em Out by Friday, The Musical Box, The Return of the Giant Hogweed, The Knife, with the occasional appearance of the Twilight Alehouse, and The Fountain of Salmacis. The end of the month brought with it two very important events. On the 25th the band were back in the BBC Studio T1 for another radio session, this time for the John Peel show, Top Gear, playing magnificent live versions of Watcher of the Skies, Twilight Alehouse, and Get 'Em Out by Friday, and on the 28th they had their very first gig in Ireland. And it was here, in Dublin, that the unimaginable happened thanks to Gabriel's fantastic imagination. While the band was playing the long instrumental part of The Musical Box, the lead singer sneaked off into the wings only to reappear wearing the most extraordinary costume, a long red dress, belonging to his wife, Jill, and a fox's head. The costume had absolutely nothing to do with the story of Henry, now transformed into the lecherous old man desperate to seduce his childhood playmate Cynthia, but brought to life the main character depicted on the FOXTROT album cover, even though the album still wasn't available in most record shops. Gabriel's initiative also took his unsuspecting bandmates completely by surprise. One of them actually found it rather annoying. Banks, well, wouldn't it surprise you if your lead singer suddenly walked out on stage in a red dress and a fox's head? He did it in this boxing ring in Dublin, at the end of The Musical Box. When we first saw it, we didn't know what was happening, we thought the stage was being invaded. Then suddenly we realized it was Peter in a dress. Gabriel, Paul Conroy, who was working as our agent, Glenn Coulson, Charisma Press Director, and I were talking about ways of trying to market this record. Paul got the music, but it wasn't really Glenn's cup of tea at all. When they saw the cover with this fox character, they thought maybe we should pay someone a few quid to wear a fox's head. I thought, if we were going to do that, then I should try doing it. So I took a red dress from my wife's wardrobe. She's told me that it was an Aussie Clark dress, probably worth quite a lot now, and I could just about get into it. The first gig where I put the fox's head on was actually in this old boxing ring in Dublin. Nowadays it is a very progressive, tolerant and open city, but at that point there was a shocked silence when I walked out on stage. Seeing a man in a dress and a sort of animal head created this visceral sense of shock that you could feel, and I thought, oh, that's interesting, we should do this a bit more. Rutherford, Pete probably realized that if he tried to run it by the band and get a committee vote on it, we'd all have said, you've got to be kidding. So he cleverly appeared on stage with a red dress and a fox's head, and we all kind of just went, wow. I think it was in a boxing ring in Belfast or Dublin, but, of course, it's funny how these things turn out. The next week, we were on the front page of Melody Maker. It wasn't done intentionally for that reason. Still, it makes you realize that, as is always the problem with the press, they like to write about stuff that's nothing to do with the music. Banks, we were never going to compromise the music, but something like that can get you a lot of publicity, and obviously it developed from that into all the other stuff. Peter's gimmick gained significant visibility for Genesis, raising interest and curiosity in their music. A classic example, in other words, of the end justifying the means. 2 days later, Melody Maker put on the so-called 1972 Pole Awards concert at the Oval in Kennington, London, featuring some of the best musicians of the year. Headlining were Emerson, Lake and Palmer, with Wishbone Ash, Argent, and the Dutch band, Focus, also performing. Genesis prepared a setlist with a completely different running order for the occasion, opening, as they had done at the Reading Festival on August 11th, with The Knife followed by The Fountain of Salmachus, Get 'Em Out by Friday, Watcher of the Skies, The Musical Box and The Return of the Giant Hogweed. For most of October, Genesis were busy with a series of gigs in the UK alongside Lindisfarne, usually the headliners, and Rab Noakes, although there were occasions when Genesis were the main attraction, with Noakes sometimes opening for them. On November 2nd at the Hard Rock Concert Theatre, Manchester, Capability Brown, another charisma band, opened for Genesis. Genesis was becoming increasingly better known, and even though they were still occasionally opening for bigger bands, their growth in popularity was evident. During this period, the band's stage setup was changed around, with Hackett and Rutherford swapping places. The bespectacled guitarist was now on the far left of the stage with Mike placed slightly further back between Steve and Peter. Apart from the odd familiar episode dictated by the usual technical issues, to fill in the gap caused by the Mellotron breaking down in Aberdeen on October 4th, preventing the immediate start of Watcher of the Skies, Phil came in with his usual drum solo. The UK tour saw yet another evolution in the setlist. Most notably, starting on November 10th, Genesis presented the complete version of its Supper's Ready for the first time at Uxbridge. Rutherford, the fact that we could go out and play one side of an album to people who had never heard it, and they actually loved it, was a compliment to the music. Supper's Ready still works today. We played it for quite a long time when Phil was the singer. I didn't realize till Phil sent me a YouTube link, how much he actually sang in the early days. I couldn't believe it. Phil doubled the whole of the first part of Supper's Ready. When Peter left and Phil started singing, people forget that Phil's voice had always been there. Including such a long song in the setlist obviously led to further changes. The Fountain of Salmachus and Twilight Alehouse disappeared, although they were occasionally reinstated, along with Canutility and the Coastliners, gone for good. Banks, I think you just move on to the next album and you have to ditch some songs. Canutility and the Coastliners was more difficult, and we didn't feel it sounded quite so good live, the first part in particular. It was a song we played live sometimes, but it's just we had too much material and it was one that the band wasn't too keen on playing. About a week later, on the 18th, Genesis were booked to play at Imperial College, London. The setlist they performed, Watcher of the Skies, The Musical Box, Get 'Em Out by Friday, Supper's Ready, The Return of the Giant Hogweed, The Knife, was now the standard and was continuously being tried and tested in preparation for a particularly important event, their first appearance in the States. The band's US debut was anything but simple, mainly because Genesis wasn't particularly well known and due to the fact that America is an immense country divided into different and culturally distinct states. In order to test the terrain, the group debuted with what can be described as a trial concert to which journalists and sector workers were invited at Brandeis University, Waltham, Massachusetts. This was a prelude to their first real concert on U.S. soil, which took place on December 13 at the prestigious Philharmonic Hall in New York. The show was presented as a Christmas concert by Charisma in collaboration with WNEW-FM radio, and had another British band, String Driven Thing, as openers. Things got off to a difficult start with Genesis being given only a very short time to soundcheck as the venue was occupied for hours by Leonard Bernstein, the famous conductor, who was rehearsing with his orchestra. Despite the various technical issues, mainly due to the different power supply voltage, Genesis' performance went down exceptionally well with the audience, making the band's first brief appearance on U.S. soil a positive experience.
The following day, the band and Stratton Smith returned to London, and on the 16th they went to Hamburg and then on to St. Gallen in Switzerland. Here, at the Hotel Eckhard, the band played to an audience of about 500, and Gabriel, despite running a fever, managed to complete the show, thus saving the newly established Swiss Rock Circus Company, which had organized the show as their business debut. After a Christmas break, a very difficult time for Phil, whose father died unexpectedly, on January 10, 1973, Genesis returned to Paris for a concert at the well-known Bataclan. This time, however, there was a television crew waiting for them. The resulting film footage, lasting 38 minutes, which would appear in fans' collections in increasingly better quality VHS versions and was finally officially released on the DVD accompanying the remastered Selling England by the Pound in 2008, includes a few short interviews and large sections of the 4 songs, The Musical Box, Supper's Ready, The Return of the Giant Hogweed and The Knife. The first 2 are particularly interesting in that after the instrumental interlude of The Musical Box, Gabriel comes on stage wearing the red, low-neck dress and the fox's head, making it the only existing video of this particular costume, which was soon to be retired. Supper's Ready, on the other hand, was marked by a very poor performance by Gabriel, who was evidently not in good vocal shape and closed on a note in crescendo and not in fade-out as would be the case later on. The international growth of Genesis was slow but unstoppable. Following their appearance at the Bataclan, other concerts had been booked for France, in Mulhouse and Strasbourg, already postponed to the 12th and the 13th of January over the original dates of the 19th and the 20th of December 1972, which, however, ended up being cancelled definitively, along with the date in Geneva, Switzerland, on January 14th, so that Genesis could perform in Germany. Genesis played 4 gigs in Germany together with headliners Lindisfarne and Capability Brown, the first of which, in Frankfurt on January 14, was also recorded by a local radio station, although only 2 songs were actually aired, Watcher of the Skies and The Musical Box. In Heidelberg, the following day, the 15th, Twilight Alehouse made a comeback to the setlist, ending on yet another Collins drum solo, which was added to cover up the usual technical issues before Get 'Em Out by Friday. It was then time to return to Italy after the 2 tours of the previous year. This time, however, things were very different. After the initial success enjoyed with Nursery Crime, in Italy Foxtrot was a big hit, and the results were immediately evident, even though the limited organizational capacity of the country once more came to light. In fact, what became known as the Charisma Pop Festival, due to the participation of Peter Hamill with David Jackson, Capability Brown and Lindisfarne, now all reduced to being support acts with Genesis headlining, was initially planned for January 18 in Rome and on the 20th in Milan. The show in Rome was moved first to the 19th and then to the 22nd, so the first date in Italy became the one on the 20th, which, instead of being in Milan, was moved to Reggio Emilia. The turnout, however, was spectacular. 8,000 tickets were sold for the Reggio Emilia date and 18,000 for Rome, an incredible number for a band which in its homeland, except for the occasional event, only managed to draw in audiences of a few hundred, sometimes less according to Richard MacPhail. I distinctly remember one week where we played in Rome to thousands of people in a huge stadium and then came back to England and we were playing the next gig in a basement club in Peterborough too. 25 not very interested people. And the contrast was just really extraordinary. Once again, the concerts in Italy, as well as being a triumph in terms of audience, were also an amazing success from an artistic point of view. The biggest surprise in a set list, which included Watcher of the Skies, The Musical Box, The Fountain of Salmachus, Get 'Em Out by Friday, Supper's Ready, The Return of the Giant Hogweed, The Knife, was The Return of the Fountain of Salmachus. Hackett, it's a complex song and it was difficult to play. You had to concentrate very hard, and it went down very badly with audiences. Every time we played it, they were really stony at the end of it, and we didn't understand why. So we stopped doing it. We believed in it so much, but audiences were left cold by it, except in Italy, where it was more appreciated. It was so far removed from rock and roll, and we hadn't really found an audience for it at this stage. I don't believe they started playing it again live until after I left, when they did it with Daryl Sturmer, when the band was more established internationally. It was a song out of time really, but it was the thing we were proudest of. We continued to do The Musical Box because it seemed that it was easier for audiences to get that, whereas the overtly symphonic nature of Fountain of Salmachus was a bit much for them. Perhaps we did a better version of The Musical Box live as we had been playing it for a while already. There was a version of it before we recorded it, and it had been honed in front of audiences, and it already had its approval. For February, another long UK tour was planned with tickets being sold for just £70, which was set to be a turning point in the band's popularity on home turf. All sorts happened, in particular on February 9 when Genesis played at the prestigious Rainbow Theatre, with string-driven thing opening for them. Regardless of the concerns within the band, Gabriel brought with him a whole trunk of costume changes to be adapted to the various songs, starting with the opening of Watcher of the Skies. "Banks, we used to bring in the whole show with this, and it may sound like a cliché, but we had the dry ice, and Peter had the makeup on and his bat wings and stuff. It was just a stunning intro, something you could only see at a Genesis concert, nothing else was like it. We put the Mellotron through the PA, with an echo so it had a big stereo effect which was very unusual in those days." Gabriel, Watcher of the Skies, was sci-fi meets prog. "I used to wear UV makeup. The show would start in darkness, and then the UV lights would slowly come on, and these big, droning chords would appear out of nowhere. Then you'd see these two little points of light which were my eyes lit up, and we had a white backcloth at that time. While in Get 'Em Out by Friday he would change various hats to interpret the different characters. Gabriel reached his biggest transformation yet in Supper's Ready, alternating a crown of thorns headpiece, the guaranteed eternal sanctuary man, his famous flower mask, Willow Farm, and the geometrical orange headdress for Apocalypse in 9/8. Collins, his wardrobe was well stocked with things by this point. And, of course, we never saw anything until it happened. The classic example is when he walked on stage halfway through the musical box wearing the fox's head and the red dress. We all kind of looked around wondering what the hell it was all about. I don't remember what the reaction was apart from surprise. I've read that Pete said he was tired of conferences about it, but I don't remember there being any conferences. I don't remember being asked or there being any trouble. Not till years later, when I said in the press that I was a bit frustrated about the fact that the five of us would be playing and responsible for the music, but Pete would be getting all the praise. The record company executives were just sort of excuse me, pushing past the other band members to get to Gabriel, and, of course, reviewers tended to talk about what he wore rather than the music. At that point, we'd still laugh about it. It wasn't until we got to a couple of albums later, when he couldn't really get a microphone close enough to his mouth for him to be able to sing into it, or by the time he did he was too tired from having to, that we started to think it had gone a little bit too far. Gabriel, Phil, I think understands and knows how to work with an audience now, but at that point he was Mr. Pure Jazzo Muso, don't bother me with any of that rubbish and let's just get on with the music. So there was some sort of tension that arrived with the costumes, like at the Rainbow Theatre. There was a ton of arguments about it, and I thought, fuck it, I'm just gonna do it.
The band wasn't a real democracy because some people were more powerful than others, and the more bloody-minded of us tended to get their way more often, as in every band the world over. At that point, they thought maybe I had something, and perhaps they shouldn't fight me because it got us on the front page. Rutherford, Pete started creating characters and becoming personalities on stage. Our audiences weren't big, but we'd started to have a following. We'd play in France and Aylesbury, in England, and there'd be a great vibe there, and in certain parts of the country, we were sort of popular. We were still playing clubs, but for once they weren't all empty all the time. Alongside the improvements in the visuals provided by the costumes, Gabriel's storytelling between songs evolved, although still mainly improvised. By this time, they had a more solid foundation. So, while the musical box was preceded by the story of Henry and Cynthia as described on the cover of Nursery Crime, before its Supper's Ready, Peter would tell the bizarre exploits of Old Michael, singing the school hymn Jerusalem, renamed Jerusalem Boogie by Gabriel. And this was all accompanied by a stage setup which was finally up to caliber. Genesis's stage manager and lighting engineer, Adrian Selby, set up a curtain illuminated by UV lights, which would hide a lot of the bulky equipment from the audience's view. The crowd was then emotionally, and sometimes almost literally, blown away by an explosion of magnesium powder at the end of its Supper's Ready, which dissolved to reveal Gabriel dressed all in white holding a luminous tube in his hand. Banks, We were developing the light show as much as we could in those days, trying to create a sort of fantasy on stage. We had this nice couple of guys who used to project these oil slides. We only had a few red and blue lights and stuff, but it was amazing what you could do if it was coordinated. Sounds a bit obvious now, doesn't it? But in those days, it was kind of revolutionary. There was a particular Rainbow Theatre performance which I felt was a very, very strong moment in the group's history. Rutherford, we always tried to present songs on stage to create an atmosphere. We bought this big gauze curtain, and we hung it behind the stage at the Rainbow, I remember, and hid the amplifiers. And we bought some UV lights just to light it up, and it looked sort of gothic, all sorts of pillars and temples, it had a real atmosphere. It cost fuck all really, which was great, the best value for money special effect we ever had, so Adrian Selby, wherever you are, well done, it was his idea. It was always a good sort of coupling of looks and music. It also worked thanks to the flower, the cloak at the end, and the red mask. In other words, Pete's performance and what he did visually with costumes, trying to paint pictures, in a sense, worked. Hackett, being as FOXTROT was complicated with difficult time signatures and the songs were invariably stories, I knew that it couldn't stand on its own without a carefully thought-out production and presentation. We needed everything, lights, sound effects, everything to help it along, so it was the nearest thing an English band was doing to an Alice Cooper-style show. He was about theatrics, not just about the music, and in a way, we were a more subtle version of that. We weren't biting heads off chickens or stabbing dolls or using guillotines, the energy of Genesis was much more subtle. If you read the classics, there was a chance you'd enjoy what Genesis did. The criticism was that it sounded like it had been looked up in books rather than being a personal experience. When the technical difficulties exceeded the usual amount of time to resolve, there was always a life-saving drum solo from Collins to fill in the gap, such as in Glasgow on February 16, while on the 17th, the musical box was interrupted about 3 minutes in by a power cut, so they went back to the beginning and started again. The UK tour with support band, string-driven thing, included around 15 live shows. It is impossible to give a precise number, 2 of which, Manchester 24 and Leicester February 25, were recorded and became the source for a first live album, Genesis Live. After getting their first taste of America in the previous December, Genesis returned to the States in the spring for a longer stay. In fact, this time round the tour lasted around 1 month for around a dozen concerts, which took the band not only to New York but also to other states on the East Coast and in the Midwest, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Illinois, Massachusetts, with a couple of stops in Canada. On some of these dates, Genesis had to settle for being the support act again, albeit for some top-flight acts, such as Lou Reed and Richie Havens, but special mention must go to the fantastic performance at the Philharmonic Hall in New York in early April, with Sandy Denny opening. Another note on the set list, which was basically the same but with an important new twist, Supper's Ready, was moved to the end, after The Return of the Giant Hogweed and The Knife. After a break, Genesis went back to work writing new music, so there were very few concerts scheduled for the months between May and August 1973, and even some of those were cancelled. The band did, however, return to the Olympia in Paris on May 7, moving on to Brussels in Belgium the following day, whereas an important event was scheduled for the 26th at the Empire Pool Arena in London, a much bigger venue than usual, but this, alas, was also cancelled due, according to a newspaper article from that time, to tickets not being printed in time. Not the most credible of excuses, and together with the statement in the same article, Genesis will not be performing live for the next 4 months while they rehearse a completely new show. No new date for the Wembley concert has been set, leads us to believe that subsequent dates, for which newspaper ads exist, such as Slew on June 30, might also have been axed. The only certainty in this period is that the band took part in the Reading Festival on August 26, where they played Watcher of the Skies, The Musical Box, Supper's Ready, The Return of the Giant Hogweed, and The Knife. This time, Genesis were headliners ahead of other acts such as John Heisman's Tempest, John Martin, the American Roy Buchanan, and Italy's PFM. A massive change in circumstances compared to their first appearance on the same stage just 1 year earlier.
Notes. 1. Mario Giametti listens to Foxtrot with Steve Hackett, Benevento, March 13, 2011. 2. Mario Giametti's telephone interview with Tony Banks, February 16, 2012, partially published in the article 6 Not Simply Shrouded Pieces in Dusk, issue number 70, April 2012. 3. Mike Kaufman's Genesis Interviews, Chicago, London, October 2007, partially used in the bonus disc accompanying the 2008 remasters. 4. Mario Giametti's interview with David Hitchcock, Fasano, June 1, 2015, partially published in the article In the Land of Grey and Foxes, Intervista Exclusiva a David Hitchcock in Dusk, issue number 80, July 2015. 5. Mario Giametti's telephone interview with Tony Banks, October 1, 2009, partially published in the article Nei Meandri della Memoria in Dusk, issue number 63, November 2009. 6. Mario Giametti's telephone interview with Richard MacPhail, May 12, 2005, partially published in the article Il Sesto Genesis in Dusk, issue number 50, August 2005.